Am I recording?
Yep.
This meeting is called to order. Good morning and welcome to the August 9th meeting of the Douglas County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. My name is Pam Wiegand and I'm the chair of the CJCC. I want to pass on a bit of information regarding how we will conduct our meeting on Zoom today. We ask that all members please turn on your video if you have it. We ask that all members and presenters mute their line when not speaking. We ask that you please identify yourself each time you speak. And if you have a public comment to make during the public comment section of the agenda, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom. Recordings of the CJCC meetings are available on the CJCC website after each meeting. Today, we want to welcome our new Criminal Justice Coordinating Council Coordinator, Katie Fitzgerald. I want to give Katie a few minutes to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me. I know that Sarah has previously sent all of you information about my background, and I've met several of you throughout my interview process. I am very excited to be here on day 8 of my employment with Douglas County. And I am slowly starting to work my way through the list of meeting with all of the members of the CJCC. So over the next several weeks, kind of watch your emails for meeting invitations from me. And I look forward to meeting each of you and working with all of you.
Thanks, Katie. In the interest of providing more time for the law enforcement contact study final report, our first agenda item will be jail population update with Under Sheriff Stacy Simmons.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Our jail population update as of yesterday morning, total head count of 193. Total in facility head count is 166. We have currently 17 housed out of county, and we have 10 that are either at Osawatomie State Hospital or State Hospital or in treatment for a total of 193. So that's where we are for our numbers right now. Obviously, with people out, that total in facility number 166 is still pushing us to the brink. There's 78 beds in our facility that don't lock. And so we're still trying to find places to put people for their safety and the safety of staff. So always a challenge every day. I can talk about the committee. Okay. So early we had a meeting looking at jail numbers of those who we have in custody, some breakdowns of those numbers. We did a point in time count the Dr. Cravens have been working on for quite a while here, and listing out who actually we have in jail, what those charges are, and some of those criminal history backgrounds that we don't normally look at when we talk about who's in jail in our numbers. Normally we show things like somebody's in here for failure to appear, somebody's in here for a warrant or a new charge, but we don't normally talk about things like what else are they in for, what's their criminal history. So we're going to do some deep dive into that. We're going to put a committee together with the Sheriff's Office, the DA's office, pretrial, and really start looking at some of the whys and who's in our custody and what those charges are. Right off the bat, with the 193, we have 18 ordered to either Osawatomie or Lorna State Hospital right now. So those folks, you can't look at those folks because they are in custody. They're not going anywhere. We have 45 individuals on holds. So even if somebody is in our custody for theft, domestic traffic, they're still not going anywhere because they have holds from other counties, other states or federal holds. And then we have 18 that are sentenced or remanded. So right off the top, there's 81 people in our facility that they're not on the table to be looked at for additional incarceration issues. 27 of those are safety risks and aren't qualified for those pretrial programs. And some of those are, aggravated indecent liberties, rape, murder, kidnapping, solicitation, human trafficking. So those are just a small list of those folks. So we do have a pocket of folks that we are looking at. We're going to do a deep dive on those to see where we are. But a lot of those folks also have some very serious criminal history. So not necessarily just what they're in for on that particular charge, but their prior histories, prior criminal histories, and prior, while they were maybe given alternatives to incarceration of house arrest, some of those folks didn't do so well in those programs. So those are things we'll be looking into. We'll be working as a committee on that, and we'll be giving you more information in the September meeting. Does anyone have any questions for me?
If I could just add on to the end of that, thank you, Under Sheriff. I'm going to reach out to Chief Judge McCabria later today and the city of Lawrence related to municipal prison, municipal inmates, and make sure we engage you all in this conversation as well. And so be on the lookout for an email from me about how you can participate and assist us with this work.
Sounds great. Our next big agenda item is the final report out on our law enforcement contact study with Dr. Jack Mcdivitt from Northeastern University and Dr. Janice Iwama from American University. I'll let you go ahead, Jack.
Thanks so much, Pam, and thanks everybody. So many of you I've seen we've been around for a while now, and we've had a chance to visit with so many of you and help through this process. Matt's going to share the screen. We'll walk you through that. I think during this trip, just so you know as background, we're going to be meeting with each of the agencies. I think most people know we're going to have a public meeting to present these results. We're going to be meeting with a whole variety of different groups. And, you know, we're really looking for feedback in the process. Where we are right now is that we've done all the analyses and we put together this draft report as a final report, but we wanted to come to these meetings, hear what people were saying, particularly the CJCC, and sort of think about ways that we could incorporate your feedback into a final draft report, which we'd like to submit back within a couple of weeks, depending on the feedback people have. So, you know, we expect to amend this, and we'd like to have your input as we go about doing that. And we're going to be doing the same thing to the departments, and we'll walk through that process for you. Some of these slides would be similar to what people have seen. Some of you haven't seen these slides before, and then when we get to the disparities, that's all relatively new, at least in terms of the way we're presenting it here. The way we've done this in the past, when we've done these kind of presentations, is to not wait till the end for questions or observations or comments. So please just, you know, unmute. There isn't that many of us. Unmute yourself, or if that's okay, Pam, and ask your questions as we're going through the process.
Jack, it might be good if folks raise their hand via Zoom,
Okay.
and then Pam can kind of can call on them.
That whichever way works for this group, fine. So we can do that as a process. So I don't want people to have questions and have to wait till the end of the little presentation here. My colleague Janice Iwama, she's a faculty member at American University. She is at the Law and Society meetings in Los Angeles today and flying in tonight. So she'll be with us for the rest of this trip and for the visits with the different law enforcement agencies. But she's not going to be able to make it to this presentation today. Okay. There we go. So just to remind you that the goals of the study when we started it way back in 2019 was to develop and implement a process for documenting traffic and pedestrian stops, to analyze the data to determine if disproportionalities exist, and to formulate solutions assisting with the development of necessary procedures and processes related to disproportionate minority contact. Go to the next one. The two things about this, just to remind people who haven't here, one of the things that's really unique about this is that this was requested by you folks at the CJC and the local law enforcement agencies. This started with a request that, you know, nobody had enough data to make an assessment of whether there were racial and ethnic disparities and how the police were doing their job. And So that started this process, and it's pretty unique around the country. Most of the time when these kind of studies are done, it's somebody being ordered to do it because of a case of police misconduct or a court order. Sometimes there's been state laws passed or municipal administrative laws passed. So to be able to come and say, we really wanted to just know is unique for this kind of a study. Going to the next one. So the scope of the work, we did the planning phase, we collected all the data, and now we're going to report back on the analysis. The way we have done these in other jurisdictions and the way this works is that, and again, I'm happy to talk some more about it, is that we can get and identify, I don't know if there's another slide, go ahead one. Yeah, so we can identify disparities, but we can't identify discrimination by ourselves just with the data. So just to go through this slide, because I think it's really important and sets the stage for what we're doing today, is that, racial profiling, as you know, is a decision by, whether it's conscious or unconscious, by an individual officer. The officer sees a car, sees who's driving, and makes a decision that she wants to pull that car over because of the race or ethnicity of the driver. We can't, as social science, measure what was going on in an officer's head. That is something that maybe a psychologist could do, but social scientists like us can't. But what we can do is to say, if officers were acting in a biased way, there would be a pattern of disparity that we can identify. Social science is good at identifying that, and that's what we're doing today, is to report back to you about this. But disparities don't necessarily mean that there's racial profiling. Sometimes, as we've talked about in the past in some of our meetings, let's say a neighborhood group asked the police to, do a targeted enforcement for speeding in their neighborhood, and that neighborhood was particularly Latino or African American, then we would likely have, for a short period of time anyway, more stops of people who live in that neighborhood because of the request to do something around speeding. So the next step in this process is really the important step, which is to tell each department what kinds of disparities they have, where they're located, so they can start to look at them, and then to ask the departments to dig into it and to be able to really say, are those disparities something that we think is not concerning because they're doing a law enforcement function, or we can't describe them and we need to try to do something like dealing with the officers who are involved. When you do this, we could control in our models, you'll see, for lots of different factors, but there's so many individual factors that cause an individual officer to be doing a particular type of enforcement, that's all something that, as we've already been to the departments and talked to them about these issues, they can know right away who their officers are that might be involved in this. So that's what the next step in this process is to work with the departments to make sure that they're drilling down to see if there needs training or needs some other kinds of follow-up with individual officers. And so that's sort of where we are in this overall process, and where we're going to try to point them is to a narrow place where they can look, because we're finding disparities there that we can't account for. So that's sort of the overall process and where we are in the process right now. And so that's what, and one of the things that we want the CJCC, two things we said. I wanted to present this to you folks first, because you've been the one that's been the steady group through this whole process from the beginning to the end. And, interestingly enough, just as a side note, there's only one police chief who is still in the role that they were when we started this process, Chief Lovett and Eudora. Everyone else has shifted roles. So everyone else has come into this process in the middle in some way. But we wanted to present it to the CJCC. And then we also would like you to think about, and maybe we can talk about it today, or you could follow up with us afterwards. Are there additional recommendations you would like to see we've got a set of recommendations that we've included, but we can add to them, particularly if CJCC members think that that would be a helpful thing to do. So we're really looking for that kind of input from you as we go through this process. Any questions at this point? Okay. Go ahead. So this is the timeline. You've all seen this. Started in May. We started collecting data into September of 2019 as a pilot program. It started in January of 2020, and we have over 20,000 traffic stops that we've documented. Go to the next one. Thank you, Matt. We're going to look at a variety of different approaches here in terms of what different ways to see if there are disparities. We have 10 separate disparity measures that we're looking at, and we're looking at it for each agency. So you can see that it gets a little bit complicated, but hopefully I'll be able to make it clear. Overall, the big finding is that there was no consistent set of disparities that would indicate widespread racial profiling in Douglas County. So the overall finding is there's no consistent set of widespread racial profiling practices. However, every agency has areas that we would say they have to go back and look at to sort of see if there are problems in those particular areas. So while it's not widespread and across the whole county, there are areas in each agency that we're suggesting they go back and look at to try to see if they can explain why these disparities are there. So these are the different approaches that we've done. Benchmarking is comparing it to the population. You'll see that first. Some multivariate analyses that try to control for other factors to see if race is still over and above other factors, the cause of disparities. The veil of darkness approach, which I'll talk about, it's an approach being used across the country. Not my favorite, by the way, but since we're using the best approaches out there, we're going to include that one. And then post-stop analysis, which is the analysis that takes place after the car has been stopped. As some of us have had these conversations in the past, police officers will often tell us, or sheriff's deputies will often tell us that they didn't know who was driving the car when they pulled it over. But that's unlikely to be the case after they've stopped the car, where they had a chance to go up to the car, get the driver's license, look at the registration, and maybe have a brief conversation with the driver about why they stopped them. So we think that those post-stop analyses are much more clean way to compare different kinds of approaches. Okay, thanks, man. Okay, in the benchmarking analysis, like are there people who are being stopped in a greater percentage than we would think in their population? That's a complicated, and some of you know this. Look at Chuck and some of the others of you know this very well. What do you compare it to? If you say I stop 21% of the people we stop are Latinos, do you compare it to the census data? Well, that's not so helpful because lots of people drive on our roads that don't live in the community that they're driving in. And so there is observational data. It's incredibly expensive, but people have gone out and done that. We have traffic stop data, which we tried to collect here, and Lawrence did collect it, but some of the other places were less successful in doing that. And what we're going to use is residential stop data. In other words, what we're going to do is say, compared to the residents of Douglas County, being stopped compared to the Douglas County population, and the population excludes young people, starts at 15 because young people aren't driving. So we find that being a pretty clean approach. So it doesn't include stops of people who aren't from Douglas County, and it doesn't include young people who wouldn't be driving anyway. So it's it's not perfect, but it's a cleaner approach. So if we go to that next one. So this shows you the residential stop data. And what we found is for Douglas County, Black drivers were 2.73 times more likely to be stopped than what we estimate their population is in Douglas County. So this is a big disparity, and it's something that needs to be looked at further. You can see that you don't see the disparities for other groups, but for blacks, it's a pretty strong disparity. We think of disparities that are, this is a ratio, so it shows you, whites to whites is 1, and this allows you to say, given their population, how many more people were stopped than we would have expected, or less people were stopped. So if it's 0, if it's under 1, it's less people. If it's over 1, it's more. So 2.7 times more than their population, our estimate of what their population would be in Douglas County. Now, one sort of caveat with this, it's unfortunate, and it goes to one of our recommendations, is when we were designing the data collection form, there was a long discussion about whether we should have the residence of the driver recorded. And people went back and forth, and there was a concern that we were asking the officers and the deputies to, record too much information. So what the compromise was to say Douglas County resident, non-Douglas County resident. And so that's what we have. So what I'd like to be able to say to you here is these are more likely in, Lawrence or the county, the sheriff's office, or Baldwin or Eudora. We can't do that. So our recommendation for this one is that each agency should dig into stops of African-American or Black drivers and look to see if they can identify who's doing them and why they're being done. One small thing that I think is really an important context for all of this is that there's if those of you who looked at the report, see there's an incredible concentration of the number of officers or deputies who are doing traffic enforcement. It's also true of those who are doing searches. So that the numbers are, nearly 60% of the people have done less than 50 traffic stops in 2 years of the officers. Some have done more than 200. I think it's almost 11% have done more than 200 traffic stops. And a few have done, I think it's 1.7%, have done more than 500 traffic stops. I say that to say that when we talk about this issue here, it's really important to drill down on who the officers are that are making those stops and do what's called an internal benchmarking comparison, which is there's a benchmark of looking at the officers from that agency and maybe the officers from a shift, if it's a bigger agency like the sheriff's office or Lawrence, and how do those officers compare? And do we have outliers in the officers? Like, is one officer who's doing a lot of traffic stops also more likely to be stopping African-American or Black drivers? So that's the approach we would take with this. And as part of it is that everybody should be looking at this to see if that's an issue in their agency, because we can't say which agencies have the biggest disparities for this measure. We can for the rest of them, but for this measure, we can't. Let me pause here and see if anybody has a question, raise their hand or. Okay, moving on. So what we did next was this multivariate kind of analysis. So it's looking at multiple factors, time of day, different days of the week, seasons, things like that. And we're looking at 3 decision points: who gets a citation versus who gets a warning, arrests versus not arrests, and searches. So the first thing we looked at was citations. Go ahead. Should pop up. There we go. And so citations, we found that there wasn't, for the county-wide analysis, there wasn't a particular statistical significant decision on who gets a citation, who doesn't get a citation. Later on in the report, I'll show you that there is some specific agencies that are involved, but at the county level approach, we didn't see a statistically significant difference by race in who gets citations and who doesn't. The next one is arrests. And the same is true. I go back one. That's right. They arrest, and the same is true. You can see the 2 stars there for searches. That means it's statistically significant. So so when looking at these outcomes, we looked at a decision to give a citation or warning, the decision to arrest, and the decision to search. For citations and arrests, we did not see people of color being disproportionately given a citation or arrested in the county level analysis. We did see them being disproportionately searched. And as we've talked about a lot, this is the case across the country. The most consistent finding in all of these studies is that African-American and Latino males are more likely to be searched than any other group. And that has, I mean, I'm happy to talk more about that, but it has lots of negative implications in terms of trust between the police and the members of those communities. It's also, you know, if you're searched and you don't find anything, it's these all kinds of negative impressions in the driver's mind. So that that's the findings of that multivariate approach. We statistically significant disparities in searches, but not in citations and arrests. As I said, this is the veil of darkness thing. As I said, overall, we didn't find widespread, but we did see pockets, and these are the pockets that I'm identifying to you. And the next thing Janice and I will do is identify them again. We've already told the agencies about these, but identify them again with the agencies in order to help them think through how they're going to deal with that. The second measure that's being used across the country is this veil of darkness measure. Again, it's not my favorite, but it is being used. And basically what it says is that if you have police officers or sheriff's deputies who are making decisions based on race or ethnicity, that those individuals, whether it's conscious or unconscious, if they're looking to stop people because of who they are, that will happen more likely in the daytime than it is at night. The theory of this outcome is that police officers are more likely to be able to tell who's driving a car when it's daytime than at nighttime. My critique of this is that it doesn't take into account lots of differences that happen within communities. You know, if you're talking about different sections of Lawrence, there's a lot more light in some places at night than there is maybe in Eudora. And so I think it's not the best measure, but it is commonly used, and we said we'd look at it. And so what we looked at is, were there more people of color stopped during the day and less stopped at night? And that would be an indication that that agency was involved in racial profiling. And in every analysis we did, and we tried a bunch of different ones, it was more people of color stopped at night. So according to the veil of darkness, we didn't find widespread racial profiling in the county by looking at, you know, the time of day when people are stopped.
I think Chuck has a question.
Yep, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think you explained that very well. The question that I've always had about the veil of darkness claim is that in studies that do this, they often find, as you did, that Black drivers are more likely to be stopped at night. And yet they never, at least to my knowledge in reading these studies, take seriously the possibility, and I wonder what you think about this, that officers may be more suspicious of a Black driver in a white neighborhood after 10 p.m. and be more likely to stop them. And in fact, that's perfectly consistent with the patterns that we often see, and that is consistent with the pattern that you see. And I'm not saying that we can tell that from your data, but I wonder how we can eliminate that possible explanation with these data. It seems like it's perfectly consistent with the data, and I'm curious what you think about that.
I agree with you completely. I think that what we find is that the suspicion level rises at night for some officers. And the second thing is this, as you suggested, there's this notion in policing of being out of place. Like I see this car full of these kind of people and they're in this neighborhood and they're out of place. I think it's a unconstitutional sort of way of thinking about things. We don't have a place where we can and can't be. But for some police officers, they see that as an indication. I'll give you an example. if there's a car full of white individuals in Boston, where I do a lot of my work, at 2 o'clock in the morning in an African-American neighborhood, the police think they're out of place because they're going there to buy drugs. On the same token, if there's a car full of African-American young men in a white neighborhood in Boston, the police see them out of place because they think that they may be trying to steal something. It's racially tainted stereotypes that they have about individual behavior. But Chuck, as you can, we can look at, we have the time of day, so we can look at some of the concentration of some of those, but we do see that in search activity. Search activity tends to take place, when at night, when they're doing stops. So we can follow up on that. Any other questions? Okay, so this is the post-stop analysis that I mentioned. And we started to say, okay, well, let's look at the decision to give a citation or a warning at the agency level. We looked at it broadly, controlling for everything else, but we wanted to look at it at the agency level. And we did see some disparities that we think are concerning and need to be followed up on. So this is citations by agency. And so we looked at who people of color getting a citation versus whites getting a citation. And the ratio here will show you that Eudora was 1.76 times more likely to give a citation to a person who's a person of color than to a white person. Similarly, the sheriff's office was 1.2 times more likely to give a citation, smaller number, but it's still concerning. And, one of our chiefs said to us, if I have any disparities, I need to dig them down and sort of try to figure out a way to deal with them. And we think that's a healthy way to deal with all of this data. Some of you maybe are wondering why when at the county level it goes away. Partly that is that if you look at Lawrence Police, the LKPD, Lawrence Police Department, they're more likely to give a citation to a white driver than they are to a driver of color. So when you put them all together, you smooth out the variance. That's why it's important to look at it at this level for each agency. So we would say from this, that Eudora and the sheriff's office have to go back and take a look at their citation practices of people of color and to see if we have an officer level issue or something more institutional level that they can start to deal with. Next one. One of the things about citations that police will rightly tell us is that not every stop is equally likely to get a citation. So some kinds of behavior are obviously more egregious than others. So we take that seriously. And what we've done is taken here the top 3 categories of stops, the top 3 reasons for a stop that are in the data, and tried to look at, do we find within that disparities? So for example, the first column here, these are only stops for equipment violations. So a headlight out, a tail light out, something like that, a muffler dragging on the ground. And for equipment violation stops, for citations, the sheriff's office was nearly 2.5 times more likely to give a citation to people of color than to white folks. Lawrence was 1.2. We've been using 1.2 as a area as the cutoff to say this is something that you should have some more at follow-up analysis on. The second column there is speeding, and speeding 10 miles or more over the speed limit. So only for stops of speeding, so that you could say, this isn't egregious, and we could talk about that. But we're not comparing a tail light out to a speeding. These are only stops of speeding. And you can see that Eudora was 2 times more likely to give a citation to a person of color than in a speeding 10 miles over. The University of Kansas was 1.4 times more likely, and the sheriff was 1.3 times more likely. One of the things I will say about some of these numbers, Eudora and KU, is that they're very, very small bases. So we have to sort of be very careful about not misinterpreting this. But I would like to give them back to the agency and say, well, can you go back and see if there's any issues here? I have a
Jack, I
question.
think Under Sheriff Simmons has a question.
Sure.
Hey, Jack. So I'm looking at our numbers here. Sorry, under Sheriff Simmons. Our numbers here, it's 2.48 for equipment or inspection violations. Were those citations or were those warnings? We don't really write tickets for those.
These were citations.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
So it's of those, it's a small number. You're right to say. That's one of the things I caution about. You know, people say that you can't compare apples to oranges. So we're trying to compare as many apples as we can, but the numbers get very small. And some of these, it may be one or two stops that change this number. Okay, that's why I'd like to go back with you guys and give you the more detail. It's in the report, but. And then if you look at other traffic I'm sorry, did you have another question?
No, I don't. I'll put my hand down.
Okay, thanks. And if you look at other traffic violations, which are those violations like moving through a red light or not fully coming to a stop or crossing over a marked lane, we don't see those kind of disparities. So we see them in equipment and we see them in speeding and not in other traffic. And those are the top 3 reasons in Douglas County why people get stopped. So the next thing we did was searches. And here what we've done is only using discretionary searches. So again, I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but some searches are not discretionary, like a search incident to arrest. If a police officer gets a warrant or a sheriff's deputy gets a warrant and they know they're going to arrest this individual, they have to search them to take them into custody. The other thing is if there's a car that's going to be towed, they have to search that car. So we've taken those out and we're only looking at searches that are discretionary, which would be probable cause, reasonable articulable facts, or consent, that they would be asking for consent. And here again, when we look at searches, we see that in a few of the different agencies, we see people of color more likely to be searched, similar to what we found in the multivariate and what we find across the country. And in the sheriff's office, Lawrence, Eudora, and KU, it was more likely that individuals who were stopped of color were more likely to be searched than white folks in those agencies. Here we looked at the searches. You can see we tried to go through all the, I'm sorry, we have a question.
Doris got a question.
Hello, Doris Ricks, community representative. Jack, I just want to know that, I know you'll be presenting this again on Wednesday, but are you comfortable with, even in your audience, talking about those discretionary searches that are more against folks of color than those that are not, and coming up with a substantial reason for that? And what will they do about stopping that in the future? Because I know this goes to 2021. So I don't know what the data looks like for 2022.
Yeah, we're comfortable that this data is all of the stops that were done in Douglas County, and it represents the searches that were done there. We do believe that this is all real. There's no estimates here, but that being said, there isn't a lot of searches being done, of people of color. So what we're finding is that we always want to put the caution out there that it could be as we're saying, it could be 1 or 2 officers in an agency that could be driving all of these numbers. And then the question is, do we retrain those officers? Do we offer them a different role in the department? If they really are biased, then we don't want to put them someplace else. But maybe there's unconscious bias training that they should go through, or maybe there's, but our hope is, I know Matt's going to be working with this data going forward, is that all of these disparities could be measured again in 6 to 9 months, and we could see, are they going away? Now the agencies know them. Are they going away or not? And so I think your point is right, that there's always going to be some noise in the data, but we're confident that these are real disparities that need to get looked at.
Hey, Jack, this is Pam. Is it possible to add like a column that tells you how many searches? You keep saying it's a small number, but I mean, I haven't taken time to look in the report, but I think it would be helpful to understand what you mean when you say a small number.
Sure, absolutely. Lawrence and the sheriff obviously do the most searches. We're talking about Baldwin or Eudora. They're very, very small numbers, but I will add those in. They're in the report, but we can add them into the table.
Thank you.
So these were the searches where no evidence was found. And, you know, one of the things about Douglas County, you see in the front part of the report, but I didn't want to take time today to talk about it, is the agencies, all of the agencies in Douglas County are much better than the national average in terms of searching people and finding things. The national average is about 25% of the searches result in contraband being found. And in Douglas County, it's more like 50. And I believe Lawrence, it's up to more than 60% find evidence. So it's much more likely that that's going to be a number that, you know, that this is something that the Douglas County law enforcement agencies are doing much better than anybody else or most of the other people in the country on average.
Chuck has
Go
a
ahead, Chuck.
question.
Yeah, thank you. In the report, so here on this slide, you present the ratios, but in the report, you also point out that no evidence is found a bit more commonly in searches of minority drivers than searches of white drivers. And so I think it's worth pointing out here that these ratios are kind of, the way you're presenting them are reversed from the other ones. That is, if it were consistent with the patterns in citations and searches themselves, these ratios would be below 1, if I understand you correctly.
Right.
So because in fact, no contraband is found more commonly in searches of minority drivers, which means that a few more of them who are completely innocent are being stopped and searched than white drivers are being searched.
Right. That's right, Chuck. And that's, we have the numbers in the report as well as the ratios, you know, as you and I have been talking about. So you can see both Pam's question about how many cases are we dealing with, and also the real differences between, you know, who's being stopped for and nothing's being found, searched and nothing being found. Go to the next one. So this is just a summary of where we are with all of this. And you can see that, you know, in the adjusted census data, it was Black residents had a disparity. Again, we're not trying to say that anybody is, that all of these are racial profiling. For those members of the media, that's not what we're saying here. We're saying that there's disparities and that the disparities need to be looked at to see if there's any racial profiling going on. But we did find it in discretionary searches. We didn't find disparities in the veil of darkness. And as you look through citations, we had disparities, equipment violations, we had disparities, speeding, and searches at the agency level. So there are disparities out there. No agency, I think the 5 or 6 disparities was the most, and we measured 10 for every agency. So it's not like somebody's doing, you know, lots of disparities and lots of things. And we have found agencies and people we've worked with in other places where every measure had a disparity. But that doesn't mean that we're in places that we need to look deeper and make sure that they can be explained, whatever's going on there. Go right ahead.
Go ahead, Stacy.
Thanks. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what Mr. Epps was saying about kind of go back to that issue of discretionary searches or searches for probable cause. I want to make sure we're using words that is saying innocent or, you know, versus guilty. We, as a sheriff's office, we do a lot of car stops at night, and we do a lot of car stops, and we do searches where we smell marijuana, and that gives us probable cause to search a vehicle. So just because we didn't find anything doesn't mean that there wasn't something there. And on Wednesday, when we had this conversation with the public, we are more than happy to talk about all of these numbers, the things that we've done, the things that we're doing deep dives into these issues.
And as you know, in our prior conversations with the sheriff has been really trying to understand whether this is a problem, and if so, how to address it. So it hasn't, I wouldn't say that this was something that people were ignoring. Absolutely, now you have all the data that we've done all the analyses, and you can now see where to dig in, and we'd be happy to be helpful in that. So that's the summary of it, and I'm happy to talk about questions, observations, suggestions for things we can do. I think I put up the recommendations. So just quickly, I'm coming on time here. The first recommendation was that everybody should continue to collect data, and Pam and Stacy and Sarah, I think you've had some conversations with agencies, and it looks like that's going to continue. I don't think if you stop collecting data, you'll never know whether whatever steps you're taking is resulting in more equitable policing. The second recommendation is talking about some new data elements that might be added now. Matt will be taking over the data collection, but I think clearly that we'd want to know what the residence of the driver is, so that we can point to whether or not an agency is involved or not. So I think that's the case. I think, as the undersheriff just said, you know, there's been recommendations from different agencies to collect data on the contraband found in more detail, and that could be specifically marijuana. So we know about marijuana searches versus other searches. And the third thing, but there might be more, is to look at, the agencies have asked to look at maybe some more gradations in speeding, that speeding 10 miles or under, or speeding 10 miles or over may not explain the severity. So that somebody who's going 25 miles over the speed limit might be treated differently as someone who's going 10. So at any rate, those are things that we recommend that they they consider adding to the form as this process goes on. The third one is, as you saw in the report, we didn't put it in this presentation, but in the report, there are agencies across the country that are Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, that are rethinking what their traffic stops are, why they're doing them, and what should they be doing. And they're making decisions to stop, to eliminate low-level traffic stops like a tail light out or a license plate light out or whatever. And, you know, we think that that's a conversation that Douglas County should engage in. They've got good data now. They know how many of the stops of each of those. They know what the result of those stops are. It may be the case that some of those might be deprioritized in agencies. The fourth recommendation is the one I've been talking about, is that we know a small number of officers and deputies conduct most of the searches and most of the stops. So the follow-up has to be at the individual officer level. I can tell you that we don't do that here, because in the past, when somebody does that, there's a FOIA request, and before somebody's been able to identify the officers, before someone is able to identify whether this officer is involved in anything that might be bias motivated, you know, there's a media outlet saying that the person is a racist. So that's better done in-house and then reported back to the CJCC. So go to the next page. So the fifth recommendation is specifically to come back to the CJCC. Maybe, you know, you may want to think about having this be more specific and having in 90 days or whatever you think is a reasonable time period, a report back from the agencies as to what they've done. but it should be communicated to the CJCC, what's been done, as well as being communicated to the community in a public meeting or on the dashboard that Matt will be constructing moving forward about that. The final recommendation is one that we've had some conversations about. It just seems like it's a nice program that's being done by over 120 law enforcement agencies around the country, where when a traffic stop is being made for a equipment violation, like a headlight out, that there may be a voucher that the person receives. And I know there's some conversation about whether or not that could be subject to bias as well, but that program, just to consider that kind of a program, because I think it raises an awful lot of good faith between the community and the police when you don't say you've got 14 days or 21 days to fix the light or you're going to be fined. Here, but you say, here's a voucher for $50 that would help you pay for the traffic violation. So those are our recommendations, but we're happy to consider additional recommendations that the CJCC or others might put forward during this visit. We can stop sharing.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Jack, I really appreciate the information. I think related to recommendation number 4, are there, you kind of mentioned, implicit bias training as a strategy to deal with sort of individual situations. Are there other best practices or strategies used in other communities that you've worked with besides implicit bias training that can be implemented and that you will share with law enforcement agencies as you meet with them?
Sure. I think that implicit bias training is really important. I think that most of the agencies that are here have had it in the past, some form of implicit bias training. At least that's what they told us. But the challenge is, they've brought on new officers, have all the officers gone through it. There's always a flux in police departments. The second area that I think is really helpful, it's a little bit less common, but I think there is some training out there to do it, which is talking about supervisors. In policing, as you all know, the supervisor is the key to controlling people's behavior. And supervisors generally are pretty good at saying, hey, you've left early 3 days in a row, or you've had 2 Fridays off, knock it off. But they don't know how to say you're stopping too many people of color. And so to give the supervisors some tools to be able to have that conversation with the officers or deputies that they work with, it is really helpful. Also, just what Matt's going to be doing is to continue to monitor this, to sort of say, have the disparities that we identified, Janice and I, decreased. I mean, everybody knows, now, they know now where they are. There should be some efforts to either have them decrease or explain why they didn't decrease. And that's sort of, so I think that the training piece, but also some monitoring, is the 2 things that are most important.
Do we have any other questions from the council? Commissioner Portillo?
This is more of a comment than a question, but Jack, I really appreciate you bringing up the supervisory training piece. That is something that in our work with Governor Kelly's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice, we suggested that Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center develop a required supervisory training for all police officers who are moving from frontline to supervisor positions. So they're in the process of developing that, though it's not going to be required in the same way that initial training is required, but I would encourage all of our local agencies to take advantage of that, because hopefully it will be available soon.
That would be great. And in your world, I'm happy to take a look at it for them to see if there's any additional modules that they might want to add in to make sure it's addressing these racial bias incidents. I mean, I think that it happens in many jobs, but one of the biggest changes in policing is when you go from being a patrol officer to being a sergeant, and there's very little training for that. And, you want to be the officers, you're somebody's friend, you don't want to lose that friendship. But, you know, it is a very difficult transition, and most police will say that's one of the hardest transitions of their career, is the first time they become a supervisor. So thank you for mentioning.
Commissioner Littlejohn.
Yeah, it's, thank you, Jack, for presenting. I think with everybody, it's really been helpful and really informative. I just had a question regarding recommendation 5.
Mhm.
And I think you already brought it up and mentioned it. Was a typical response time getting back to you know, bodies such as this or the community itself, like 90 days, or is that typical across the country or other places you've seen, or has it been another set amount of time?
No, I think that everybody has the data now. All of the agencies have the data and can look at it. So I think 90 days is a reasonable time. And I think you want to have a certain, you want to hear back soon. You know, you don't want to be a year from now. It should be something that's fairly quick, so they can get back and at least talk about the steps that they're doing to reduce it.
If we don't have any more questions from the council, do we have any from the general public?
Yes, Terry Wiltz, I'm going to allow them to speak.
Thank you. Terry, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I want to point out that this is a study of violators. And so I am going to assume that there are people who speed and have other minor traffic violations who are not stopped or cited or otherwise paid any attention to at all. So Jack, do you think we can take this racial disparity and go that direction with it, that X% of white people who drive too fast do not get stopped? Or is there any, can we get any statistics on that phenomena? Also, these communities are so small. The officers involved probably are familiar with many of the makes of the autos. They're familiar with the people that they're stopping. And was there any way that your study could take a look at that? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That two things, you know, you're absolutely right that people violate, let's say speed, for example, at different rates, and that everybody does speed. There was a study done in Pennsylvania that said they took police officers not on the job and had them go in a car and see when they could pick up a violation that they could pull someone over for. And generally speaking, it was 28 seconds and they found the violation. So we all tend to go a little bit over the speed limit. You can be pulled over going 1 mile over the speed limit, but we aren't. And so the challenge with that is, when is it really a threshold that is reasonable to pull someone over? Because we all do violate the law fairly consistently in traffic enforcement. It's hard to measure. That's the point, and we can't measure that as well. I'm sorry, your second question was?
Did you have any way to note whether the officer had any familiarity with the car? Because we live in small communities.
And there's been a conversation with the police to try to see about how to measure the car, the type of car. It's a complicated thing because there's so many different makes and models and numbers and that, but it is the case that it goes down on the citation, so they know how to do it to some level. They tend, you're absolutely right. There are frequent flyers out there that police know about that, you know, they've stopped in the past and they see them and they see the car, and it's not just an idea. I think you're really perceptive in what you're saying. It's not an idea about, when you talk to police officers about it, it's not just who they saw in the window, but there are certain types of cars they associate with kids. There are certain types of cars they associate with, you know, young men who drive fast. And so those kinds of decisions are all part of the decision to pull this car over and not that car. Because the reality is, as you say, they could pull almost all of us over almost any time.
So is there any discussion of adding that to the training?
Yeah, the police departments have been talking about adding that field so they can monitor the types of cars that people are pulling over.
Yeah, Pam, I trust there's notes taken on these meetings.
Oh, yeah, we keep notes on all these meetings. Do we have any other questions or from the public? Santa,
No, no other questions.
any other questions from the council? Well, seeing none, I'm gonna adjourn today's meeting. Oh, Sarah, do you have something you want to say?
Sorry, yeah, I was
No
trying to unmute pretty quickly. Maybe Jack, and you could kind of go into a little bit about, I know you're presenting tonight to the City Commission, the Lawrence City Commission, and I know you sit, your meetings with agencies. And, we had a bunch of chiefs that just happened to not be able to be at this meeting today, but I know they're going to be represented, in the community conversation tomorrow night. I guess I was hoping to talk a little bit about next steps with this group.
Sure.
And kind of where do we, do we have, commitment to continue to, I know we've got commitment to collect the data, but also to continue to review strategies and then bring that back to this group.
I think Under Sheriff, do you have a question? Stacy?
I do. Thank you, Under Sheriff Simmons. From the Sheriff's Office, we're going to continue to collect the data. We're going to continue to review the data, bring it to you. You want to review in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, that's fine. We're open to all of that. That's not an issue. As we collect it, it'll be there for you. So whenever you want to see it.
So maybe at our next CJCC meeting in September, we could just have a brief conversation with law enforcement agencies that they could just report back the process and structure they're going to use to continue this work, not the actual, collection, but just the process and that they're going to continue to collect and evaluate the strategies.
This is Commissioner Portillo. Sarah, I really appreciate that suggestion because we did hear from chiefs the last time we were discussing this report that there was a commitment to continue to collect the data. But I think that timeline and what do we do with the data is a next really important discussion, because if we just collect it and don't use it and see what's working, what's not, it's not going to make much of a difference. So I think it will be a good idea to have a timeline of how frequently we want to tap back into this conversation and how we want to seek collaboration between all of the different agencies within our community to say, what are the policies and practices that are making a difference?
Under Sheriff Simmons.
Thanks. And I just wanted to say, from the Sheriff's Office perspective, we're going to change our form a little bit on how we collect. So I don't know how that will change with other agencies. Like right now, I think the cutoff for speed is 10 miles an hour. Which is maybe fine for a city, but not so much for us. We're going to, I think, raise ours to 15. And so we're also going to change some of our information about why we searched, not necessarily just if we didn't find anything, but there's some different parameters there. So as we look at how those numbers come out, they might not match, I guess, exactly to other agencies. It'll be more of a standalone for us, I think, is what we're trying to get at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Under Sheriff, and I think that's fine. I just think that's one of those things that perhaps, working with Katie and Matt so that everybody's in the loop and determining where really do we need to be consistent? Where is it that information is important and where is it, maybe it's a separate checkbox, some of those types of things. I just would encourage, and I feel bad because you're the only law enforcement agency represented on the call right now, that we continue to meet as a group and figure out how we're going to review that data together.
And just from my point of view, if the changes are small and they could be adopted by each agency, as an example, Eudora does a lot of speeding stops. They're a small town, but they'll do a lot of speeding stops. And so I do think that it's probably good to the extent possible that all agencies embrace the changes that any agency wants to do. It's not going to change the time or the difficulty of it, really isn't.
Craig, go ahead.
Thanks. I'd like to think I represent a law enforcement agency, and we're very much committed to continuing to use the data, learn from it, get better. So I have no qualms about making that commitment right here. Chief Lockhart is ill, so otherwise he would be making the same commitment, I'm confident. But happy to do. I just want to make sure that you hear that from us on this call.
Thank you. Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is Chuck Epp. I just want to second Jack's recommendation that when changes to the form are made, that we put some effort into trying to make them consistent across the agencies, because that'll just make more efficient the process of data analysis and comparing improvements over time. And I think, for example, with regard to the sheriff's office issue of speeding, there would be a way of making changes to that field that would work across the agencies and would provide us more useful information. So for example, under 10, 10 to 15, over 15 is a very simple sort of change to the form, and it could be useful across the agencies, and it would be useful for addressing the issue that the undersheriff was mentioning. And I would also just want to say I'd love to be a part of those discussions about tweaks to the form, as I'm sure Jack would as well, because there are certain things that could be done to improve some of these fields and the information from them quite a bit, I think. It is a great form in general, but a few tweaks would be really useful.
That's great. Thank you for offering. I just remind everybody there's some more presentations that Jack and Janice are going to do tonight, City Commission, tomorrow County Commissioners, and tomorrow evening at the Public Library at 6:30, there'll be a panel of law enforcement and Jack and Janice doing the presentation for the public. Do we have anything else for the good of the order today? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Our next meeting is September the 13th. I'll see everyone then.